So now we're gonna do the butt
Start
weld.
over. Do it again.
Huh?
Do it again.
Are you ready now?
I'm ready.
Okay.
I just want to make sure I get the whole thing.
We just got done with the lap weld where we lapped two pieces of steel together. Now we're gonna do the butt weld where they're just touching instead of overlapping. So with this, what you want to do is, depending on the thickness of your steel, you're gonna want a little bit of a gap between the two pieces to make sure that you get as much penetration as you can with your weld and get it down into the gap. So a rule of thumb is that you take the thickness of the steel and half of that thickness is how big you want your gap. The steel we're working with right now is pretty thin. I don't know, what is that, like an eighth inch steel? So really, as long as you can see a little bit of daylight through it, it's probably gonna be enough, because by the time we melt the surface of the steel to get the puddle penetrated down in there, then it's gonna be pretty much all the way through the steel already. So just any kind of daylight through there would be fine. In an ideal world, what we would do is cut a little bevel in it and butt them up real tight so that it's just a thin piece of steel backing it, and then you lay a nice cool bead first to get that bottom penetration, and then you lay a couple extra beads over top of it to make sure that it's fully covered with weld and fully connected through to each other. So that's what we'll do. We'll just lay that there. Again, make sure that you're in a nice position, comfortable position, and your steel is solid. See how that one's kind of bumping up a little bit? So what I'll do is when I'm welding, I'll just put my hand right there and hold it down. You could take another clamp if you have one, or you could even tack it right to the table a little bit if that's what you want, if that's how you felt more comfortable. But for me, I'm just gonna hold my hand on there while I'm welding, run my bead down through there, and then once the bead is there, then obviously I can let go and it'll be a solid piece of steel.
In the shop, let's not tack anything to the table.
Okay. We won't be tacking anything to the table.
That will just snowball into
Yep.
fully welded tables.
I'm with you. Okay, so we've got these two pieces butted together. Again, I'm just gonna hold it there. I'm gonna get comfortable. I'm gonna be relaxed. Athletic stance, knees bent. Here we go. Cover, strike. Now I stopped halfway through to kind of show you what's happening. One thing that I did not do this time, which we did on the lap weld, was tack each end of the weld. Now if you come over here and look, you can see that the gap on this end of the steel is starting to grow a little bit. So as I'm welding, it's shrinking up here and pulling these two pieces of metal together that way. And that's creating a larger gap on this end. That's why it's important to tack both ends before you start welding. And also, as you'll notice when I get done, by the time I'm done, this piece of steel, instead of looking flat like this, it'll start to do this. So really, with a butt weld with two small pieces of steel, there's really no good way to counteract that unless you were to flip it over and lay another bead down the back side of it, which really is what you should do to create the best weld you can, if it's possible to do that in the field. But for right now, we're just gonna weld here. And another thing I wanted to show you too, which is why I stopped halfway, if you look at my bead, if I were to finish the bead, you wouldn't be able to see the position of it. You would never know where in the bead the gap was. So if you look, I'm a little bit, right now I ended off a little bit more on this side of this, on this piece of steel than this piece, but I'm doing my best to stay right in the center. Keep that line right in the center of your crescents as you're making them. So you want to melt this side, come over, melt this side, come back over. You want to keep going back and forth and keep that line right in the center of your crescents, and that's going to give you the best penetration and the best structure for your bead. So now what I'm going to do before I go much further, I'm going to come back to this side and I'm going to tack this end so it doesn't spread anymore.
But would the best idea have been to tack them both at the beginning?
Yeah, that's what you should do, is tack anything that you're welding together. You always want to tack every point where the metal meets. I mean, even if it's a long stretch, you want to tack spots along that stretch. Otherwise, it'll warp and it'll twist as you're welding it, and that's not going to be a good situation for you if you want something that's going to be tight and smooth and exactly how you want it. So I'll come, like I said, I'll come back here, I'll tack this, and actually maybe what I'll do is I'll flip it over and do the back side of this half that hasn't been welded. Maybe that'll help keep it from folding in half like that. Cover, straight. So again, just a little tack. It doesn't have to be crazy. Just something to be there so that the metal doesn't try to spread anymore. And then what we'll do is we'll flip it. And you can see on the back side, you can see where I've been welding already. It's starting to come through a little bit. Right there, you can kind of see it trying to poke through. That's a good sign. That means that I'm getting good penetration. But again, without cutting a bevel in there and doing it the perfect way, you're not going to get all the way through the metal, which is why you're going to want to flip it over and do a bead on the opposite side if at all possible. So like if you're in the field and obviously if there's something on the back side of it that you can't get to it, you're obviously not going to be able to do that. But in order to make as much penetration as possible, you can just grind a groove in there for all that matters. So like I said, any way, shape, or form that you can get that full melting, swirling action through the whole steel is going to be the most beneficial. So now I've got that side tacked, this side's welded. I'll do the top half and I'll come right down through the whole butt, and then I'll flip it over and do the other half of the other side. Cover, strike. Cover, straight. Flip it over. I already chipped this side off. Cover, straight. And there's your butt weld. So we'll chip it off. One thing you might have noticed on the other side as I was starting my arc is that it took me a little bit to get it, to strike it and get that arc started. There's a bunch of different techniques that you can do. Some people like to just touch the metal and bring it back, and that kind of gives them, I find for me that's kind of tricky because every time I touch it, it wants to stick, and then you got to sit there and bend it back and forth and rip it off, or shut the welder off quick so that it doesn't burn anything up. The technique I like the best is the scratch technique. So you just bring it, lay your rod on the side, scratch against the metal, because that flux will give you a gap between the two pieces of steel, between your electrode and the steel you're welding, so that it creates a little arc. And once that arc starts, you can bring it up and pull away a little bit to get you that gap that you need. The tricky part about doing that is that you have to bring it to your metal and be prepared to start welding as that arc is starting. I mean, you can move that arc wherever you need to move it as long as you maintain the arc. It's just the farther you move it, the harder it is to maintain it. So once you bring it across and you get it started, then you can start your weld. That time there was a little bit more flux on the tip, so it didn't create the arc as good as I wanted it to. It doesn't matter if it takes you 5 minutes to start an arc. It's not a big deal. As long as you get it started and you get your puddle started, that's what matters. As long as you can pay attention to what you're doing once you get that arc started, it doesn't matter how long it takes. So now we have our butt weld made. You can look, it's fairly straight, but you can see this was the side I started on. You can see that it kind of pulled that back piece a little bit this way instead of keeping it nice and straight, but once I flipped it over and did that other side, it kind of held it in place. So now what we could do, and if you look, I don't know if you can really see it, but if you look on the ends, you'll be able to see that the two beads kind of melted together. That means that I've got full penetration all the way through there. A good way to test this would be to put it in a press or something and bend it, make sure it bends instead of breaks. And it should bend somewhere in the middle here instead of bending at the weld. I mean, obviously, unless the weld was directly in the center. But if it breaks along the weld, along the side of the weld, that means you were too hot, you undercut it too much, and now the weakest point in the steel is along the outside of the bead. If it breaks right in the middle of the bead, that means it was too cold or you didn't get enough penetration. There wasn't enough steel there through the weld to maintain structural integrity. Okay, that's the butt weld.